All right. Hey, everyone, aiming for those top UPSC ranks. Let's tackle a topic that's sure to pop up on your exams. The whole multiculturalism and nationalism thing.
Definitely key concepts.
Yeah, they're not just like some abstract ideas.
Yeah.
They're really shaping, global politics, societies, and grasping those little nuances. It's really key for both mains and prelims, isn't it?
Absolutely. You've got it. These forces, they're always interacting. Sometimes it's smooth, sometimes it's a bit clashing, and you'll need a good grasp of how they work to really nail those UPSC questions.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So let's break it down.
Yeah.
Starting with like the basics.
Sure.
What are we even talking about when we say, multiculturalism and nationalism?
Okay, so think about it this way. Before we had the internet and like super easy travel that kind of shrunk the world, nations that often kind of clone to this idea of being a single unit, like everyone's the same shared language, culture, just one dominant story.
Right.
And that's that classic view of a nation state driven by nationalism, that strong sense of loyalty and belonging to that shared identity.
Yeah, that we're all in this together kind of vibe.
Exactly.
But the world's a lot more connected now, right? We've got friends all over the place, our workplaces are diverse, and this mix of cultures, it seems like the new normal.
It is, and that's precisely where multiculturalism steps in. It acknowledges this reality of increasing diversity and stresses the importance of respecting and even celebrating those differences.
Yeah.
Instead of aiming for that one dominant culture, it's about togetherness and difference, as our source material puts it.
So more like a vibrant mosaic where each piece keeps its own beauty but adds to the whole rather than the old melting pot idea.
I like that visual, though maybe a tad simplistic. The mosaic thing doesn't quite capture those tricky bits about integration and the potential for clashes, but it does highlight a key shift. Countries like the USA, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, they're increasingly adopting multicultural policies, recognizing just how diverse their people are.
Right. It's not just theory anymore. It's real-world policy.
Exactly.
But you mentioned friction. What are some of the challenges that come up when we talk about multiculturalism?
Well, if we emphasize that ethnic belonging and celebrating differences, does it kind of unintentionally create separate groups within society? How do we balance that with national unity, the idea of everyone feeling like they're part of the same nation?
Yeah.
That's where it gets a little tricky.
It's like walking a tightrope, promoting diversity without undermining that social glue. That must spark a lot of debate, right?
It does. Some argue that multiculturalism weakens national unity because it focuses on what divides us rather than what we share. Others see it as a way to enrich society, create a more inclusive sense of belonging. And this debate really plays out in how we approach minority rights, which our source material highlights.
Minority rights, okay.
Yeah.
How does that fit into the multiculturalism puzzle?
Think of it as a way to safeguard the unique culture of minority groups within these diverse societies. Language rights, religious practices, even holidays, all these things allow those groups to keep their identity while being a part of the bigger society. It connects with the concept of communitarianism, where the group's self-worth and identity are really central.
So it's about finding that balance, respecting individual and group identities within that larger national framework.
Yes.
But surely there's no one-size-fits-all approach to multiculturalism, right?
You're right.
I mean, how do different political ideologies view this whole thing?
You're right on the mark. There's a clear tension between how liberals and conservatives see the compatibility of multiculturalism and nationalism. Liberals, particularly those advocating for liberal multiculturalism, tend to stress civic unity. They believe diversity should thrive in the private sphere. Individuals choose their cultural practices, their lifestyles, but the public sphere should be about shared civic values integration.
So it's about finding that common ground, that sense of shared citizenship that ties everyone together regardless of their background.
Precisely. They argue this helps both individual expression and national cohesion. It's a form of civic nationalism where belonging is based on shared values and political allegiance, not just ethnicity or culture.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing conservatives have a different take.
They do. They tend to view multiculturalism and nationalism as fundamentally at odds. Their argument is that shared values, a common culture, are essential for a stable and successful society. Humans, they'd argue, are naturally drawn to those who are similar and wary of those who are different.
So from their perspective, emphasizing cultural differences might actually lead to division and conflict, not unity.
That's their concern. They worry that multiculturalism could fragment society, erode that sense of national unity that's so crucial for stability and cohesion.
Okay, so two very different perspectives, each with valid points. But this brings up a big question for me. If we're talking about diverse societies, is ethnic conflict just unavoidable?
Yeah.
Is that the natural outcome of people from different backgrounds living together?
That's a common assumption,
Hmm.
but our sources actually challenge that view. While diversity can sometimes lead to tensions, the evidence suggests ethnic conflict isn't a foregone conclusion. Socioeconomic factors play a huge role.
So you're saying economic inequality, social divisions, those things often contribute to ethnic tensions more than just cultural differences.
Exactly. Think about it. When you have different ethnic groups concentrated in different socioeconomic levels, unequal access to resources and opportunities, it breeds resentment conflict.
It's not just about cultures clashing, it's about access to power and resources.
Right.
Are there any real-world examples from our sources that illustrate this point?
Absolutely. Amy Chua, a very prominent scholar, argues that globalization has actually made ethnic divisions worse in many parts of the world.
Really?
She points to instances where globalization has led to a concentration of wealth in the hands of small, often ethnic minority groups who are able to exploit global markets.
So we're talking about situations where a particular ethnic group gains a lot of economic power while other groups feel left behind, and that creates tension.
Exactly. And this can lead to resentment, prejudice, even violence. Chua calls this phenomenon a world on fire.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It really underscores how intertwined economics, ethnicity, and social unrest can be.
It does. It also highlights how important it is to address socioeconomic inequalities as a way to reduce ethnic tensions. It's not just about promoting cultural understanding, it's about ensuring everyone has fair access to resources and opportunities.
Okay, so we've unpacked a lot already. Definitions, different perspectives, and real-world examples. I can already see how all this is crucial for anyone tackling those UPSC exams.
Absolutely. It's not just about memorizing definitions. It's about applying these concepts to real situations, analyzing current events through this lens.
Connecting the dots between these abstract ideas and what's happening on the ground, both domestically and internationally.
Exactly. That's what demonstrates a deep understanding of these complex issues, and that's what UPSC examiners are looking for. Now, before we move on to the resurgence of nationalism, is there anything from this initial exploration that particularly stands out to you?
What strikes me is how dynamic these concepts are. We often think of them as fixed, but they're constantly evolving in response to global events, social movements, even technological advancements.
You're absolutely right. It's not a static picture. And speaking of evolution, let's shift gears and delve into a topic that might seem a bit contradictory at first. The revival of nationalism, even in our increasingly interconnected world. How do we make sense of that? It is a bit of a paradox, isn't it? You'd think with all this globalization, nationalism would fade away, but actually it's surging back. It's like globalization is breaking down those national walls, but also reinforcing national identities at the same time.
So how do we make sense of that? What's driving this comeback of nationalism in a world that's supposedly becoming borderless?
Well, to understand it, we need to look at the different ways this nationalism is showing up. One big one is what we might call national self-assertion. After the Cold War ended, lots of countries, they weren't held back by that old world order anymore, and they started flexing their muscles on the global stage.
Like a newfound confidence, a sense of, we can do things our own way now.
Exactly. And this often turns into a bolder foreign policy, a bigger focus on national interests, and a willingness to challenge the way things have always been done globally.
Interesting. So not necessarily aggression, but more a stronger sense of national pride and wanting a say in world affairs.
Precisely. And this ties into another way nationalism is coming back, cultural and ethnic nationalism. This is where things get a little more complicated, especially with multiculturalism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does cultural and ethnic nationalism fit into all of this?
Well, in many countries, this rise in nationalism goes hand in hand with a renewed focus on traditional values, cultural sameness, and sometimes even the idea of ethnic purity. You could see it as a pushback against all the diversity that multiculturalism embraces, a longing to go back to what some see as a purer national identity.
Almost like a let's get back to our roots feeling. But doesn't that clash with those inclusive multicultural ideas?
It definitely creates tension. This kind of nationalism often shows up in policies that try to protect a specific language, religion, or cultural practice. It can also lead to talk that excludes people seen as outsiders, creating suspicion and even hostility.
That sounds a bit worrying, especially given everything we've discussed about diversity and inclusion.
It's a valid concern, and it's really important to recognize that this form of nationalism can be twisted for political gain, stirring up xenophobia and discrimination.
It seems we need to be able to tell the difference between healthy national pride and that more exclusionary, divisive kind of nationalism. Where's the line?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that societies are always wrestling with. This brings us to another major factor behind the resurgence of nationalism, the backlash against globalization.
Uh-huh. So we're back to that paradox. We talked earlier about how globalization has in some ways fueled nationalism.
Right, globalization has brought lots of benefits, but it's also created anxieties and insecurities, especially for those who feel left behind by economic shifts or threatened by what they see as a loss of traditional values.
It's like that feeling that things are changing too quickly, getting out of hand, and national identity is getting lost in the process.
Exactly. And this often translates into support for protectionist economic policies, stricter immigration controls, and a general pullback from global cooperation. It's a desire to build walls, literal and figurative ones, to protect against the perceived dangers of globalization.
So this resurgence of nationalism is partly a reaction to the downsides of globalization. It's about regaining a sense of control and identity in a world that's changing so rapidly. This seems incredibly relevant to the UPSC syllabus, right?
Absolutely. Understanding the ins and outs of nationalism, its historical roots, its different forms, and how it interacts with globalization is crucial for both the mains and prelims exams.
It's not just about memorizing definitions. It's about being able to analyze what's happening in the world right now, dissect political speeches, and understand the forces that are shaping the global landscape.
Exactly. And this knowledge will prepare you to tackle essay questions on topics like the effects of globalization, the challenges of multiculturalism, the rise of populism, and the changing nature of the nation state. These are the big picture issues UPSC examiners love to test.
It's about understanding the forces shaping our world and the challenges and opportunities they bring. This deep dive is really paying off for exam preparation.
I hope so. To make it even more practical, let's connect these ideas directly to what UPSC aspirants need. What are some key things they should remember?
Well, first and foremost, understanding what multiculturalism and nationalism mean is crucial. That's the foundation for all your analysis.
Right. You need to be able to explain the core principles of each concept and differentiate between different interpretations and approaches. You might get a multiple choice question on the prelims that asks you to do just that.
Second, it's essential to understand the historical context. How did these ideas develop over time? What were the major events and movements that shaped them? Knowing this adds depth to your answers.
Absolutely. It shows that you understand how these ideas have played out in the real world, not just in theory.
And third, maybe most importantly, being able to analyze real-world examples. How are these concepts playing out in different countries? What challenges and opportunities do they present? This is where you bring in case studies and specific examples.
That's where your analytical skills come in. You need to be able to apply these concepts to what's happening in the news, dissect what politicians are saying, and understand the underlying forces shaping the global landscape. It's about connecting theory and practice, showing the examiners that you can think critically about how these abstract ideas work in the real world.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground exploring the different sides of resurgent nationalism.
Yeah.
But before we move on, I have a question. We've talked about the different forms. It can take some more worrying than others. But is it always a negative force? Can nationalism ever be a force for good?
It's a great question. I think we often connect nationalism with, its more negative sides, but you're right. It can definitely be a force for positive change.
Yeah.
Like any ideology, nationalism has a whole spectrum. It can be a powerful driver of unity, solidarity, progress. Think about those historical movements for national liberation, for example.
Right.
They were often fueled by this deep sense of national identity and the desire for, self-determination.
Right. Those movements often led to more freedom and autonomy for groups that had been oppressed. So it's not so simple as saying nationalism is good or bad. It all depends on the context and how it's expressed.
Exactly. The key is to be able to tell the difference between, healthy expressions of national pride and those more dangerous forms that can lead to exclusion, intolerance, and conflict.
Yeah.
And that ability to analyze those different forms of nationalism, that's something UPSC examiners are going to be looking for.
Okay, so let's get practical here. How can all this knowledge about multiculturalism and nationalism help our listeners ace those UPSC exams?
Well, remember, these topics aren't just some theoretical stuff. They're really connected to what's happening in the world right now, all the policy debates. Think about issues like immigration policies, citizenship laws protecting minority rights, national security concerns, even cultural diplomacy.
Yeah.
These are all areas where a nuanced understanding of multiculturalism and nationalism is super important. You might be asked to analyze a specific policy or something going on in the news in an essay question, and you'll need to use these concepts to create a strong answer.
So it's not just about repeating definitions, it's about applying them to real situations and showing your analytical skills.
Exactly. UPSC examiners want to see that you can think critically and connect the dots between the theory and what's happening in practice. Let's say you get an essay question that asks you to analyze how globalization is impacting national identity.
Classic UPSC essay
Right.
topic. It's broad, complex, and needs a deep understanding of both globalization and nationalism, which we've been exploring throughout this whole deep dive.
Exactly. To tackle that essay, well, you'd need to use everything we've talked about, different expressions of nationalism, the tensions between multiculturalism and national unity, those economic and cultural anxieties that globalization fuels.
And you'd need to support your arguments with solid examples from different countries. Don't just talk in general terms. Show those examiners that you can apply these concepts to the real world.
Absolutely. Give them specific case studies, analyze real policies, and illustrate your points with evidence.
Okay, so that's one potential essay topic. What else might our listeners come across?
Well, another one could be a question about the challenges of multiculturalism in a globalized world.
Ooh, that's a hot topic.
It is.
It gets right to the heart of questions about identity, belonging, social cohesion, even the very definition of a nation-state.
To answer that one effectively, you'd need to discuss those different models of multiculturalism, the tension between individual rights and group rights, the potential for both conflict and integration, and the role of the government in managing diversity.
It's about showing you understand those complexities and being able to explain different perspectives.
And don't forget about the prelims exam. You might get multiple choice questions that test your knowledge of basic definitions, key thinkers, or historical events related to multiculturalism and nationalism.
So it's about having a solid base of factual knowledge along with those analytical skills.
Exactly. Make sure you really know those definitions and familiarize yourself with important scholars and their ideas. For example, you might see a question about Will Kymlicka's work on minority rights or Charles Taylor's concept of multiculturalism.
Good point. It's all about combining that factual knowledge with the ability to analyze and apply those concepts.
Precisely. And remember, these concepts, they're not static. They're always evolving based on what's happening globally and societal shifts. So stay curious, stay informed, keep making those connections.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the definitions, the history, the complexities, and how multiculturalism and nationalism show up in the real world. And most importantly, we've tied it all back to how you can prepare for your UPSC exams.
We've given you the knowledge and the analytical tools to take on those tough essay questions and handle those tricky multiple choice questions.
But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought-provoking question. In a world that's becoming more and more interconnected, where technology is making borders less important and cultures are always mixing question, what does the future hold for the relationship between multiculturalism and nationalism?
It's a question that's going to keep challenging policymakers, scholars, and everyday people all around the world.
And it's a question that you as future leaders are going to be dealing with throughout your careers.
So keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the limits of your understanding.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, don't forget to subscribe and give our podcast a like for more in-depth explorations of complex topics. We're here to help you succeed.